Hi, everyone. Good evening. Great to see you all again. For those of you unfamiliar, my name is Dustin Smith. I am the Executive Director over at the Blair County Historical Society and the Baker Mansion History Museum, and it is a pleasure to see you all here today. Of course, as always, just a couple quick announcements regarding our events before we get started here. First and foremost, our next and final presentation for the 2024 season will be taking place next month on November 20th. For that presentation, we will be welcoming Eric Shields and his presentation on They Came from Blair County, which ties directly into the third volume of his book series of the same name. So we hope to see you all back here for that. And then really the only other event that we have left for this season thus far is our lantern tours of the Baker Mansion, which take place on October 18th, 19th, 25th, and 26th. So coming up this weekend, in fact, is our first set of tours. Tickets for these are $5 per guest, and we actually have some for sale out at our table tonight. Spaces are filling up quite quickly, so if this interests any of you, I would recommend acting fast because they've been known to sell out very quickly. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jim Lowe here, our chairman, and he's going to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you all for coming.
All right. Good evening, everyone. As Dustin said, it's great to see everyone this evening. This is the second to the last installment of our lecture series this year. And if you have a topic, I'm putting together the schedule for next year, and I have about half of the spots filled. But if you have a topic you're interested in on something related to local history, please reach out. You can contact me personally. I usually stand outside and thank everyone for coming when this is over, or I can give you a business card and you can email me. But if you have something you're interested in, I'd love to hear what the topic is, because we've been doing these lecture series now since, well, I did the first one for the anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack back in 2016. And at that point, we started a yearly series, and we've had quite a number of topics, but I'm running out of ideas. So if you have something you'd like to hear, I'd surely like to hear your thoughts on that. So at this point, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Michael Allison, and he sort of did that on his own here and went over some things that he does. Usually when I'm introducing him, it's because of his talents, his artistic talents with the brush. And he mentioned all of the variety of projects that he does as an artist. And he was a recent recipient of one of our Blair County Historical Society Heritage Awards for his work in Baker Mansion. If you haven't been to Baker Mansion for a while, come out and see us. You'll be amazed. For quite some time, from the time the Historical Society took over Baker Mansion until just recently, about 2015, the interior of the mansion was what I would describe as milquetoast-like. Somebody came in and basically made all the walls off-white, and it looked nothing like it did originally. Well, due to the talents of Michael Allison, it's been restored to its grandeur, and it is magnificent. So if you haven't seen it in a while, please come out and visit. So with that, I guess I should get to introducing what he is here for tonight, and that is to speak about German heritage. And I can say this because he's been a featured speaker in every year of our lecture series. He is a master folklorist and a great storyteller. So you're in for a real treat tonight. Michael Allison.
Thank you. They say at parties there's three things you shouldn't discuss: politics, religion, and sex. We're going to start right off with two of them. We're going to talk about why the German immigrants came here, largely because of political and religious combat and fighting. So that's two of them. And later on, when I go down my genealogy, a lot of German farm families and lots of kids, so that kind of takes in the last subject. So anyway, so we're going to try to answer the question tonight: who were these Pennsylvania Germans? You've all heard of the Pennsylvania Dutch or the Pennsylvania Deutsch, and we have these assumptions about who they are, and I'm going to tell you that right off the bat, most of those assumptions are wrong. Because they're modern assumptions. They have nothing to do with the time period when the Germans first started immigrating here. And I also want to tell you that the idea that we don't like immigrants is not a new idea. I'll read this quote. Why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them? And we will never adapt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion. And that was none other than Benjamin Franklin saying that. So, yeah, that's a founding father, by the way. So, one of the reasons why the Germans came here was because of a little event that had to do with a little thing called the 30 Years' War. And what I want to talk to you about is that particular war, why it came about, and, you know, it literally was one of the most devastating wars in the history of Europe. Here's what happened. During the medieval period, come on, advance. There we go. During the medieval period, the Holy Roman Empire attempted to unify Europe under the Catholic Church. In 1800, Charlemagne was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor. He was crowned by Pope Leo III. However, while this didn't prevent wars, it certainly boosted the tax revenue of the Catholic Church and did create a lot of rivalries throughout Christian Europe until the time of the Protestant Reformation. In 1618, Ferdinand II of Bohemia, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, was deposed by Frederick V of the Palatinate, who was a Protestant. And if you look up at the map, you'll see that Bohemia is actually on the western side here, and the Palatinate is on the eastern side. So at that point in time, there was these divisions spring up, mostly caused by religion. But also realize that Germany was not a unified country. It was made up of literally dozens of principalities and small city-states that were all autonomous. And they were all ruled by princes and regents who had their own ideas about how their people should live and once the Reformation started, what their religion should be. So, Ferdinand's son, Ferdinand III, was raised by Jesuits. Ferdinand II was very tolerant. He was like, okay, Protestants, Catholics, we can live and let live. It'll be okay. You know, you do your thing, and we'll do our thing. It'll be all right. However, once he was deposed, his son came along next to take the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor. He had been sent away and raised by Jesuits, and he had no toleration for the Reformation. He loudly announced his policy of reconciliation, which involved all the individual rulers of the German provinces returning to Catholicism, and of course bringing all their people along with them. Needless to say, this started a war, and it was a prolonged war, with other countries in Eastern and Northern Europe sending mercenaries into Germany. Everybody said, we can get a piece of this pie. So Denmark rushed in, and Denmark exhausted their finances and their army, which allowed Sweden to become the most influential country in that particular part of the world. Wave after wave of soldiers throughout the provinces and from Denmark, Sweden, and also the Netherlands descended on the German countryside, burning, pillaging, and just devastating everything. The Netherlands had just recently escaped Spain's rulership, and so they were ruled by the Habsburgs. Now, the Habsburgs are a very important family because they were also in Austria and parts of the Eastern German provinces. The Habsburgs were the Holy Roman Emperors, and they also were the kings of Spain. And it's an interesting combination, which you'll see later. But So the Austria sided with Bohemia. Crops and farmland were completely destroyed over and over and over again. It was so bad that the bubonic plague sprung up again. There were famines. The wolf population increased. And there was so much paranoia that they began the witch and werewolf trials in the German-speaking countries at this time. Now, you may have think of those as being perhaps just Scottish or English, but we're literally talking about thousands of people being executed for what was perceived to be their practice of black magic or their ability to transform into a wolf. And it was truly horrendous. Almost 8 million people died during the 30 Years' War. It was truly devastating. And finally, the war ended, and there was a series of documents produced which together became called the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia is considered one of the first humanist documents. It recognized the autonomy of the Dutch, so they never should be invaded by Spain again. It removed a principle called inus reformandi, which means that if a ruler changed his religion, all the people had to change theirs too. Got rid of that, said, no, you change your religion, leave your people alone. So they weren't forced to follow suit. It also forbade the influence in political affairs by outside institutions. In other words, this is a country, this is a principality, this is a city-state, leave us alone, don't invade. Didn't always stop it, but it was a step in the right direction. So that's the Treaty of Westphalia. Come on, there we go. But what happened next, here comes the sun, as the Beatles used to sing. It left everybody kind of in a weakened state. And while it limited the influence of the Protestant and Catholic countries in the German provinces, the Habsburg estates refused to take part in this. So Austria, once again, and Spain created their own autonomy, and they created a mutual support network. It was just a matter of time before a powerful ruler would try to take advantage of the power vacuum caused by the weakening of the Holy Roman Empire. There's continued to be a Holy Roman Emperor, but he had literally no effect on the affairs in Europe after this. So the Sun King, Louis XIV, looked around and said, well, let's see, I've already killed all the Protestants in France. Maybe I should check out Germany because they seem to be kind of weak. So he immediately invaded Germany and started another war. That was all it took. People began looking for an exit visa. And if you look at the map, you'll see different outlines here, different circles. These are the regions we're going to be talking about. This is where the people came from. This is where our ancestors came from, especially the ones who came over in the early to late 1700s. So the Habsburgs, as you can see, they began to decline. This is the list of them, and it's hard to see the colors here, but basically, the red lines are where an uncle married a niece. The gold lines were first cousins who married, the gold lines, and the others were just regular old boring marriages. But what happened was the Habsburgs became incredibly inbred. I don't know if you can make out the picture at the bottom, but that's Charles II, the King of Spain. He had what now we call the classic Habsburg face, a long, long nose, a lantern jaw that hung way down. His teeth were so bad he had trouble eating. He never had any children because he may have been sterile. But, you know, all I can say, folks, is don't marry your first cousin over and over and over again, or your sister or brother. So that takes us to the big question. Who are the Pennsylvania Dutch? Well, the immigrants, who we call the Pennsylvania Dutch, are broken down into two groups. One are the gay or the fancy Dutch. They tend to be high church people. They are high church Protestants, Roman Catholics, people like Lutherans, and the more liberal members of groups like the Church of the Brethren. The plain Dutch tended to be people who came out of a movement called the Piety Movement, which was an attempt to reform first the Lutheran Church, because just like the Puritans in England, they thought it was too Catholic still. And so they wanted to get rid of authority-based churches, and they also thought that anything that was not literally in the Bible was a false practice. So, and one of the things they all zeroed in on was child baptism. They thought it was coercion. So it's adult baptism. It's not good works, because, you know, the Catholic Church was selling indulgences back then for good works, especially if you gave them a lot of money. And it was faith alone and a literal interpretation of the Bible. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more. So who were the fancy Dutch? Well, the fancy Dutch were people who more easily integrated themselves into American society. They're the ones who tried to blend immediately. You saw what Franklin had to say about the Germans coming in. So you'd have Lutherans, Catholics, Moravians, and more liberal branches of the Reformed Church. These groups were more easily assimilated into the culture. So we'll talk about these various faiths. First off, we have the German Reformed Church. So there was a reform movement, as I said. They were trying to decatholicize Lutheranism, and some Reformed religions came under the influence of Calvinism. So they became more strict and much more conservative. And there was an ongoing splintering of the Protestant movement. John Philip Boehm brought the Reformed Church to Pennsylvania. From 1725 to 1740, he established 12 churches. Each was to develop a constitution of governance by the members of the church, not by an authority figure. That may sound familiar. It's an early form of democracy. So that's the first group that came in. The next group was the Moravians. The Moravian Church's heritage can be traced to 1457 and the lands of the Bohemian Crown. There you go. These are the dissenters from Bohemian Catholicism and the Habsburgs. Moravia, Silesia, and previously the Hussite movement against several practices and doctrines of the Catholic Church. Their name is derived from exiles who fled from Moravia to Saxony in 1722 to escape the Counter-Reformation. That was when the Catholic Church decided to double down and introduce that fun activity called the Inquisition to the Protestant lands. So they established a Christian community in Herrenhut. It's known as the Unity of the Brethren of Herrenhut. This came with them a strong folk art tradition, which was extremely influential in Germans and later Czechoslovakian states. When we start talking about arts and crafts, you're going to see that Moravian influence all over the place. And they founded several communities in Pennsylvania with biblical names like Bethlehem and Nazareth. Those are Moravian communities. Okay, so actually the Moravian Church was one of the earliest dissenter churches. They predated Luther. So next, we have the Lutherans. So the Lutheran churches in Pennsylvania have largely been founded by lay ministers. After Nicholas Zinzendorf was successful in winning a number of converts to the Moravian Church, the Lutherans asked German churches for formally trained clergy. In 1742, Henry Muhlenberg immigrated to Philadelphia, responding to the 1732 request by the Pennsylvania Lutherans. He took charge of the Augustus Lutheran Church in present-day Trapp, Pennsylvania. He also provided leadership in a series of congregations elsewhere, including ones from Maryland to New York, where he worked to secure control over less qualified pastors and started new congregations among the settlers of the region. Now, he had a particular thing that bothered him. He considered independent pastors who were non-seminary trained to be fly-by-night grifters who would establish paid schools and churches and then abscond with the money from those collection plates in those schools when the going got rough. And he wanted to crack down on that by imposing good old-fashioned Lutheran authority figures in these churches. He created the Pennsylvania Ministerium, which was the first permanent Lutheran synod in the United States. He helped prepare a uniform liturgy the same year and wrote basic tenets for an ecclesiastical constitution, which most of the churches adopted in 1761. He did work on a hymnal, and that was published in 1786. Now, another thing that I'd like to point out is that every time we're talking about a publication like a German Bible or any other publication that was religious, these were written in High German. So there were various types of German, and actually most of the people who were coming here spoke High German, but in different dialects. So these dialects would begin to come together and form almost a separate language, which we call Pennsylvania Dutch. However, this is the interesting point. That mixed dialect, the closest language it comes to is Yiddish, which was spoken by Eastern European Jews. It was a total accident of cultural assimilation, but yes, Pennsylvania Dutch and Pennsylvania and Yiddish are very closely related. Okay. Now comes the Catholics. Old St. Joseph's Church was founded by Joseph Greeton, who was born in 1679. He was an English Jesuit. There's the Jesuits again, who was born in London and came to Philadelphia from Maryland in 1729 to establish a mission. He originally celebrated Mass in his house at 321 Willings Alley in Philadelphia. He created the first chapel in 1733, almost certainly a house chapel attached to his residence. The rights of Roman Catholics in the province of Pennsylvania to worship at this Romish capital, that was the disparaging term for Catholics, was challenged the following year by the deputy governor of Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly ultimately decided not to ban celebrations of Mass and cited William Penn's Charter of Privileges as controlling, despite the fact that the English had laws against such things. Nowhere else in the 13 colonies could Catholics enjoy public worship to the extent possible in 18th century Philadelphia. And the priest, when he died, he was buried in Bohemia, of all places. Now, realize that Pennsylvania, because of William Penn's insistence on religious toleration, became a beacon for all these various dissenter religions, because they were all looking for the opportunity to come and practice freely because of the experience of the 30 Years' War. They wanted to be left alone for the most part. So next we're going to talk about the Plain Dutch, who are the radically reformed, which includes the Schwarzenau Brethren, the German Baptists, who around here were known as the Dunkards, the Mennonites, and the Amish. Have any of you ever heard of the Dunkards? Okay, good. Yeah, if there's a very important map of Blair County that was created when Blair County was first being made out of the northern part of Bedford County and the southern part of Huntington County. And if you go to the Library of Congress, you can pull up the map, and it's a PDF file. You can expand it, incredibly detailed. And coming down along the Juniata River, down into Morrison's Cove, one Dunkard church after another, after another, after another. It's really something. And my dad used to talk about the Dunkards in the Cove when I was a little kid. So anyway, and then of course the Mennonites and the Amish. So now we'll talk about the Plain Dutch, and this can get complicated. So there were two reformers. They were both former Catholics like Martin Luther. In 1590, this gentleman named Heinrich Zwingli, became the Luitprester, or people's priest, in Zurich, where he began to preach ideas on the reform of the Catholic Church. In his first public controversy in 1522, he attacked the custom of fasting during Lent. In his publications, he noted corruption in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, surprise, promoted clerical marriage, priests should marry, attacked the use of images in places of worship. Among his most notable contributions to the Reformation was his preaching, started in 1519 through the Gospel of Matthew, before eventually using biblical preaching to go through the entire New Testament, which was a radical departure from the Catholic Mass. He primarily got up and preached, no other ceremonies. He also clashed with the Anabaptists. Those are the people who believe that you shouldn't baptize children. So that was one little point of difference. There was enough to cause a war. Zwingli formed an alliance of Reformed cantons, which divided the Confederation of the Swiss Confederation along two religious lines. His ideas came to the attention of Martin Luther and other reformers, and they met at Marburg discussion group and agreed on many points of doctrine, but they couldn't reach an accord on the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So his alliance tried an unsuccessful food blockade to the Catholic sections in Zurich. That started a war, which they weren't prepared for, and he died on the battlefield. So his legacy lives on in confessions, liturgy, and church orders of the Reformed churches today. The other guy, not my favorite person, John Calvin, he was a French theologian. He was a pastor and reformer in Geneva during the Protestant Reformation. He was a principal figure in the development of a system of Christian theology later called Calvinism, including its doctrines of predestination and of God's absolute sovereignty in the salvation of the human soul from death and eternal damnation. Once again, the idea that doesn't matter if you do good works, doesn't matter even if you pledge your life to Jesus, God knows whether you're going to hell or not, and you don't really have much to say about it. That's predestination. It's a little bleak, just a little bleak. So Reformed Presbyterian churches are some of the churches that follow this, also Baptist churches, and many of the literalist churches that exist today are followers of Calvinism. And it spread throughout the world. He was also accused of turning Geneva into a theocratic state, and he was responsible for the death of Michael Severus. So I'm going to just say Michael Severus was another Spanish Catholic reformer. He thought Christianity got off the rails after the very first church councils, where they determined that God was a Trinity. He was an anti-Trinitarian. And because he thought that's not in the Bible. There's suggestions of something going on there, but it's not in the Bible, so why should we believe it? And that's where we went wrong. So he was very open-minded and rather pleasant person, and he would write to Calvin about his ideas, which outraged Calvin, by the way. He hated these ideas. But Michael Severus thought, here's a great intellect just like me, and I'll go to Geneva and listen to him preach. So he went to hear Calvin preach. He was recognized in the church where Calvin was preaching. He was immediately arrested, and then his buddy had him burned at the stake. Yeah, fun. Okay. We'll keep on going here. So the Schwarzenbau brethren and the Dunkards. There's a gentleman named Alexander Mack who was born around July 27th in 1679 and died on the 19th of January, and was a German clergyman and the leader and the first minister of the Schwarzenau Brethren, or the German Baptists. Now, these are not the English Baptists. This is a totally different group. So they were part of the Schwarzenau province in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. Nice thing about German place names, they get longer and longer. He founded the Brethren along with 7 other radical pietists in Schwarzenau in 1708. And let me define the piety movement. This was an idea that reacted against the influence of Calvinism. But they also really hated high church pomp, ceremony, and the idea that churches should be run by outside authorities. Their idea was that people coming together in a community would support each other and help us all develop our own holiness. And that you should not be fancy, you should be plain. You should not be tempted by the temptations of the world. So no alcohol, no fancy clothing, no pursuing wealth and fame and things like that. They were very plain. So the Schwarzenau brothers espoused these ideas, and they opposed any coercion in religion, including infant baptism. So they were Anabaptists. And the New Testament would be the only creed they'd follow, and it would be their rule of faith. So he was a universalist and a strict pacifist also after the 30 Years' War. Who wouldn't be a strict pacifist? And many pious maintained that new birth, in other words, becoming a Christian as an adult, had to be preceded by the agonies of repentance, and that only a regenerated theologian could teach theology. In other words, if you hadn't gone through the agony of realizing that you need to become part of a Christian community, then you weren't qualified to say anything about the New Testament or to teach. So anyways, they shunned worldly amusements, dancing, no theater, no public games. And some people believe this led to a new form of justification through good works. So, and it weakened the power of the church organizations. The more strict German Baptist brethren became known as the German Baptists, or known as the Dunkards. And while Dunkard is a German name, it literally means to dunk. And that's how adult baptism was viewed by people from outside the Anabaptist movement. They were dunking people, literally. I know it sounds silly, but there you go. All right, now, the Mennonites. Menno Simmons, in 1496, was another Roman Catholic priest, and he came from Friesland, which is from the Low Countries, and he was excommunicated from the church, and he became a very influential Anabaptist religious leader. He was a Catholic priest who was a contemporary of the Protestant Reformation, and people like Luther and Calvin and people like that. And from his name, it followed that his followers became known as Mennonites. So, his study of the scripture led him to believe that infant baptism also is not in the Bible. He was another Anabaptist. He was influenced by the Dutch philosopher Erasmus of Rotterdam, and the island Frisia that he came from is just a little island off the coast of northern Germany, sort of between there and Netherlands, and different people have claimed it throughout the years. One of my good friends, whose grandparents came here as dairy farmers, well, not here, but to Florida, they were Frisian. So it's where he came from. So they practiced the believer's baptism. Anyway, he and like many of the pietists, they rejected the influence of Calvinism that was creeping into Protestantism. Now, there's another guy who's also very important, and that's Francis Daniel Pastorius. He was born in 1651. He was a German-born educator, lawyer, and poet, and public official. He was the founder of Germantown, Pennsylvania, and it was a settlement and gateway for immigrants from Germany. He joined the Lutheran Pious in Frankfurt in 1679 and repeatedly urged adherence to Christ's golden rule. He came to Pennsylvania 4 years later. He grew increasingly liberal, espousing universalism and moving very close to the Quakers. So, in 1683, a group of Mennonites, Pious, and Quakers in Frankfurt, Germany, the so-called Original 18, included Abraham Opp and Groff, a cousin of William Penn, approached Pastorius about acting as their lawyer and agent to purchase land in Pennsylvania, which he did. Pastorius took passage aboard the ship America and arrived in Philadelphia on August 20th, 1683. In Philadelphia, he negotiated the purchase of 15,000 acres from William Penn, the proprietor of the colony, and laid out the settlement of Germantown, where he would then live for the rest of his life. So, have you ever been to Germantown? Anybody? Okay. Wonderful, old colonial city, cobblestone streets. It's a great place. I encourage you all to go there and check it out. There were others who came. Johann Conrad Beisel. He was a German-born religious leader who in 1732 founded the Ephrata community in the province of Pennsylvania. He was born in Eberbach, and that was then part of the Holy Roman Empire, and emigrated to Pennsylvania in 1720. He had intended to join a commune of hermits founded there by Johannes Kelpius. But Kelpius had died in 1708. Beisel met with Conrad Mathai, an associate who became his principal spiritual confidant. The group around Kelpius had arrived in 1694. They settled on a ridge above the Wissahickon Creek. They were known as the Hermits of the Wissahickon. There they prayed, meditated, and watched the stars because they believed the second coming of Christ was imminent. They were an end-of-the-world group. They taught children. They started schools, taught children in the community. Some were celibate until death. Others were married. In 1732, Beisel established a semi-monastic Baptist community called the Camp of the Solitary, with a convent and a monastery at Ephrata in what is now Lancaster County. Celibacy was considered a virtue, but not obligatory. Each member adopted a new name, and Beisel was called Friedsam, which the community afterwards added the name Gottrich, Son of God. Which the community believing families settled near the community, accepted Beisel as their spiritual leader, and was worshiping with the community on the Sabbath. He composed one of the biggest books of hymns in Pennsylvania at that time. He was primarily a musician, and his composed books of hymns still exist to this day. By the way, that cave there, that's known as the cave of Kelpius, and it's still there. I don't know if that's actually where Kelpius ever set foot in there, but it's known as the cave of Kelpius because that's where some of the hermits lived above Wissahickon Creek. You can go visit that. It still exists. All right, our final group is the Amish. They were a group of traditional Anabaptists and fellowships, and they had Swiss and Alsatian origins. As they maintained a degree of separation from the surrounding populations and held their faith in common, the Amish have been described by certain scholars as an ethno-religious group. In other words, a group all their very own. They're related to the Old Order Mennonites and Conservative Mennonites, and they once again are part of the Anabaptist community. The Amish are known for simple living, plain dress, Christian pacifism, and slowness to adopt the conveniences of modern technology, with a view neither to interrupt family time nor replace face-to-face conversations wherever possible. You know, one of our great failings as a culture is social media, because nobody talks to each other face-to-face anymore. So good for the Amish. And they opposed compulsory military service. They settled in an area called North Kill Creek watershed in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, and that was opened for settlement in 1736. And that year, Melchior Detweiler and Hans Strieber settled near North Kill, and shortly thereafter, many Amish families began moving in there. In 1742, the group was large enough to petition the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly of the province of Pennsylvania for naturalization rights, allowing them to purchase land. The group was strengthened in 1749 when Amish Bishop Jacob Hetzler settled in North Kill, and the settlement grew to nearly 200 families. So, if you have people in your background named Yoder, Berkey, Troyer, Hostetler, Harshberger, or Detweiler, those are some of the names of the original Amish settlers here in Pennsylvania. So, now, needless to say, the first things people wanted to do was establish farms. The cities were already established. They were English-speaking cities. These people spoke German and often came here with just the clothes on their backs. So we're going to talk about their farming techniques next. So among the things that they created here and that were unique to them was a really powerful small horse called the Conestoga draft horse. That's one of them right there. They created stone barns because their practice from Germany was to winter over the livestock rather than to allow it to be out in the fields during harsh weather, during the winter time. They, of course, established cottage gardens for vegetables for their own use and, of course, to collect herbs. And, of course, small, crowded farmhouses with what they called summer kitchens. In other words, the cooking went on in a shed attached to the farmhouse during the summer months when it would be too hot to cook inside. So one of the things that we like to talk about the harvest is the slaughter of animals. This is the only part that comes close to one of my usual talks, because most of my usual talks are about spooky and gross things during Halloween, but especially the slaughter of pigs. And we have this saying called everything but the oink was utilized. So the first thing you did was, unfortunately, kill the animal and then bleed the carcass and collect the blood for sausages and puddings. Then this animal was scalded and the bristles were scraped off the hide because the kids would collect the bristles, size them according to length and quality, and then take them into town and sell them to the local brush manufacturer. A way to make extra money. So then the animal would have its innards removed, and the first act was to clean the intestines. Get them nice and clean because you were going to use that as sausage casings. Okay? Then you started cutting up the animal. You cut hams, ribs, and belly meat, which would be smoked and turned into bacon. All that would go in the smokehouse. But there would also be fresh sausages, which you could eat right away. Then the bits and pieces would be gathered together in a big pot with herbs and onions and things like that and cooked into a broth. The German name is Metzelsuppe. The Metzelsuppe would be something that people would eat, but that was traditionally given to the poorest members of the community. Because when you were taking care of a 150-pound hog, and trying to collect the lard and all that kind of stuff from it for use in cooking, if you've never had a pie crust made with lard, you don't know what you're missing. So that and various puddings would be given to the poor, and also to the preacher, who was usually not being paid very much. He would get sausage, Metzelsuppe, and puddings as well. So after that, more bits and pieces would be added to the pot along with cornmeal and more spices, especially pepper, and that would be cooked down, scooped out, and put in loaf pans. And that was called pondhaus, or scrapple. All right? Who has had decent scrapple here? Not bad scrapple, but decent scrapple. Okay, great. So you know what I'm talking about. And that would be fried for breakfast or sometimes eaten right out of the pan with a spoon. So other bits of meat like pieces from jowls and the trotters, which is, of course, the pig's feet, would be jellied in aspect with vegetables and herb to make sauce, which my dad used to eat that stuff. I always thought it looked like somebody threw up. It was pretty gross looking. That sauce right there in the center, it does look kind of gross. Also the other name for sauce is head cheese. So yeah, all right. So now we're on the topic of food, which is one of my favorite topics. So we have a range of very common Pennsylvania German foods that you might see going into a farmhouse kitchen. And if you don't like the taste of sweet and sour, you're out of luck because so many things were sweet and sour. So first off, we have a breakfast of scrapple with eggs and sausage gravy. We have sausage and sauerkraut in the center. We have cucumber salad. We have ham pot pie. We have stuffed hog jaw. And we have ham loaf, which is meatloaf, but made with ham. Now, I want to say something about, you've all seen the promotions for Pennsylvania Dutch restaurants. Come to Good and Plenty and eat good and plenty, that sort of thing. That was actually a tourist promotion that started about the time that the automobile became popular. They wanted to get people to vacation in Pennsylvania German farm country, and people wanted to open restaurants for the tourists. So that's when the whole idea of Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine came about. It was actually a tourist promotion, simply promoting the things that people were eating all the time at their farms anyway. All right, so we'll keep on going here. We have German potato salad with bacon. I like it hot. Some people like it cold. That's okay. We have various relishes and preserved vegetables like piccalilli and chow chow. We have apple butter. That's a classic. And other farm butters like pumpkin butter and things like that. Coleslaw, chicken and dumplings, one of my favorites when I was a kid. Pickled eggs and beets, and of course ham loaf there. And we'll go further, and we have crumb cake, shoe fly pie. Now, the whoopie pie, or the gob, was created in New England, but it needed to come here to be perfected. We have apple dumplings, donuts, which were made specifically to eat before Lent, and they were very cakey donuts. And were, of course, deep fried in lard. That's the greatest way to deep fry. And clear candy toys that were made out of sugar. And finally, sand tarts. My grandmother and my aunt made the best sand tarts. They were crisp. They snapped when you bit into them. They were just covered with cinnamon sugar, and they all had a little nut on the top, and they were paper thin. You could literally read through them. They were the most delicious cookie I think I've ever eaten in my life. And I'm not just saying that because of my relatives. Okay, so let's talk about arts and crafts. A lot of, they had to bring everything with them because they brought nothing with them, so they had to make everything here. So one of the things we associate with the Pennsylvania Dutch are hex signs. All right, that's a misnomer. These are not to prevent witches' curses. These are actually Moravian designs to bring good luck. You'll see birds of paradise. You'll see bluebirds known as disselfinks. You'll see various star and flower representations. You'll see hearts representing love. You'll see the seasons represented by colored leaves and things like that. However, if you do see a barn with a six-sided star on it, that's a hex sign. That's to prevent bad magical things from happening to the animals on your farm. Because they did bring their superstitions with them, and we're going to talk about that too. Another thing was an art form called fracture. Fracture has that same sort of Moravian influence design to it, but these were hand-decorated documents. Baptismals, even obituary documents could be decorated and framed and put up in the home, marriage licenses and things like that. These were traditionally done completely by hand by a calligrapher who would put all the same types of motifs on these documents. We'll talk about that a little bit more shortly too. Another craft was paper cutting. These were silhouette cuts. Oh, no, wait, I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Decorated furniture. And you can see the same motifs again that you saw in some of the hex signs and also in some of the fracture illustration. This type of early farm furniture is incredibly valuable. If you can find it in an antique shop with the intact paint job on it that hasn't been touched up or hasn't been redone, expect to drop a lot of bucks on that. But this is how they decorated their home. They thought everything should be decorated in the home, and they hand-built furniture. They couldn't bring furniture with you on a crowded ship in the early 1700s, so they were building their own furniture. And another craft was Scherenschnitze, which was paper cutting silhouettes. And these would be used, once again, to decorate the home. Some of these are very modern, as you can see, but some of them were actually old-fashioned motifs. Once again, that's sort of facing a balanced Moravian design principle running behind everything. The other thing they didn't have, that they couldn't bring with them, is ceramics, plates and dishes. So they discovered, much to their delight, that Pennsylvania was loaded with clay. Hard to plow, but great for reducing down and making terracotta pottery out of. Now, just a second. I have a couple of examples here. We can pass them around if you promise to send them back intact. All right, now these are both modern pieces. These are not antique pieces. There's an incredible collection of Pennsylvania redware pottery in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And one of the people who is represented there was the only living person represented in their collection, and that's the guy who made this plate for me, Lester Breininger. Lester was a guy who was a high school science teacher. He bought an old ironmaster's home, sound familiar? And as he was restoring it, discovered a rubbish pit across the street. So he started digging through it, and he came up with all these pieces of broken redware pottery, which he became fascinated by, and he started doing a study, and then he started making it. And so he became such an expert on it that his pieces are collected in the collections of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and at places like Muhlenberg University and other places that have these kind of collections. So one of the things that they used to do, besides these lovely decorations, once again, was to write things on the back to memorialize the day when the pottery was collected. Like this one says, "Too damn hot. Waiting for some cooling rains." Now, this piece is a modern piece. It wasn't made in Pennsylvania. This was made outside of Portland, Oregon. But this has been influenced, so we'll start that around. Be very careful. And this is a Lester Breininger piece. These would be formed over wooden molds. When they got hard enough to fire, he would fire them once, glaze them. Now, he used modern glazes. The old glazes often had lead in them. So it was a little hard when you were trying to eat off of it. But it says here, L. Breininger, Robesonia, that's where he lived, Pennsylvania, July 21st, 1996, cloudy out. So there you go. Yeah, Lester was a really fascinating guy, and when I was a museum curator, it was a real honor to know him. So, okay, so we'll move along, and we'll talk about what do you do when you've come to a country and you're living in your isolated communities among people who practice the same religions as you, and you get sick. Well, you go to a healer. Now, one of the first books of healing published in Pennsylvania was Sauer's Herbal Cures. Christopher Sauer Jr. lived from 1721 to 1784. You can still get this book. It's on Amazon. They were very, these were the kind of cures that you would go to, if you had a cold, if you had the flu, if you fell down and broke your leg, things like that. These were herbal cures. These were herbal medicines. When my grandmother died, now her married name was Allison, but her maiden name was Imler. And one of the things we inherited were huge mason jars full of herbs that she collected. And one of her favorite things to cure everything was bone set tea. Have you ever drank that stuff? You have? Tasty, huh? No, it's terrible. I guess if it didn't kill you, it cured you. But yeah, this is one way that you would try to cure yourself, by creating poultices. And you literally had to do this by hand. So he wrote down all the folklore around this. But once again, this is how people practiced medicine back in the day. The other way was powwowing. Powwowing was basically magic. So people were trained to be what we call powwow doctors, and they had a book that they used called The Long Lost Friend. The Long Lost Friend was actually a translation of a German document. And it was created by a man named Holdman. He came to Pennsylvania and was a fracture painter. He discovered that as he became very popular, he could really churn them out if he printed them first and then hand colored them. So he bought a printing press. And then while he's making fractures to distribute, he thought, well, how about a book on curing people? So he translated this book, which once again, you can get on Amazon. It's still around. The first half is written in German. The second half is translated into English. And this is a book that people would use to do all manner of things. How to dye things in permanent colors, for example, is in here. How to create a physic for cattle. Take aloe, 10 drachmas to 1 ounce, Epsom salts, 4 to 6 ounces, powdered ginger, 3 drachma, mix and give it in a quart of gruel. For calves, 1/3 of this will be a dose. So if you have a constipated cow, that's how you take care of it. There are prayers in here that you can say to make you invisible to thieves. You're calling on the Trinity. There are all manner of things. How to slice a potato and put on a wart to get rid of the wart. There's all manner of things in here. But powwow doctors have been considered to be witches during certain periods of time. And this book has been very influential. You actually find this voodoo doctors using this in New Orleans. It's a very famous book. And once again, like everything else, you can get it on Amazon. This would be another way. If your grandmother's herbal cure didn't cure you, you might find a powwow doctor who might not want you to pay him, except for maybe giving him food or alcohol or something like that, and he would perform a cure. Okay, so moving right along. I know this is a long talk, but we're all Germans here, so among the other things that they brought with them is superstitions. The Hexen wolf needs no explanation. It's an upright walking wolf man, which was very scary. There's the Elberdricht, which is a really weird bird. And they said that these creatures, people brought them with them from Germany. And they put them out in Pennsylvania, and they were out in the fields. And a very popular thing for the older gentlemen in the farm community to do is get all the young kids out and go hunting for these birds. Did you ever hear of a snipe hunt? No. That's the origin of it right there. So anyway, that was one thing. Another thing was their Schnellergeist. So whenever something weird happened around the farm, livestock got carried off, chickens and things like that were stolen, and you couldn't figure out what happened, they blamed it on the fast ghost because it didn't leave any trace behind. And that eventually got corrupted into the name Snallygaster, which is used in southern Pennsylvania and all throughout Maryland as this horrible creature. But it was a folklore item called the Schnellergeist. And then finally, we have a couple other things. Now, the one is fairly rare. The stolen fenster are called soul windows. They're a little tiny window that you would sometimes see in a farmhouse, usually near a bedroom or near a parlor where, what they used to do when someone passed away, they would lay them out in the parlor. If you did not have a way for the soul to escape, you would end up with a haunted house. So the soul window was there for the soul to get outside the house. They're rare nowadays, but you can still find them if you're going through Lancaster County and looking at really, really old farmhouses. And the other thing is red string. This is Sophia Baylor right there. She is dyeing red string and thread. And that was used, once again, she was a powwow doctor. And you would wrap that string around an injury or around a wart or around, an infection and keep it on there, and that would magically cure it. So there she is. She's dyeing red ribbons, actually, for her powwow work. Okay, enough of the folklore. Let's talk about celebrations. Let's get crazy. So the first one was New Year's. And don't be offended about the word holiday, because we're talking about all of them, not just Christmas. First off was New Year's, and you can see a beautifully decorated New Year's card wishing people to have a happy New Year. Another common thing was to use molds for puddings and for casserole foods and also for cakes. And the shape was usually in that of a fish. There'd be two fish approaching each other, or even better, a fish chasing its own tail. There's a motif called an Ouroboros. It's a symbol of eternity. And so the idea of the fish biting its own tail was to create that in a more Christian symbol, which, of course, the fish was a Christian symbol. And one of the great customs was to eat pork and sauerkraut on New Year's. Who eats pork and sauerkraut on New Year's? Anybody? Put your hand up. Oh, nobody in the audience. Okay. And of course you would say, Props New Year, or may the New Year turn out well. The reason you ate pork, do you know why you eat pork at New Year's? The same reason the Chinese do. The pig roots forward, not backwards. Chickens go back and repeat themselves. Cows go in circles. Horses go in circles. Pigs always go forward. And so you want the new year to move forward. And of course, you have your preserved cabbage. So why not combine the two? So that's pork and sauerkraut. The next one is something else you may have heard of, Groundhog's Day. The German farmers in Germany wanted to get a head start on planting. So they would go out after the first of the year and look for animals that were hibernating, that were coming out of their hibernation, and seeing whether they went back in or not, or whether they stayed out. If they stayed out, it was a predictor of an early spring and the end of a mild winter, and they could get planting earlier. However, in Germany, those animals were bears and badgers. They came to Pennsylvania and discovered while we did have bears, we had a lot of groundhogs. And so they switched animals, and that started a new tradition. Once again, Valentine's Day, they celebrated that. Here's another hand paper cut Valentine's, really beautiful. This craftsmanship is amazing. I don't know if you've ever seen this kind of work or not, but it's truly beautiful. Easter was an important celebration. And of course, it started on Good Friday. The eggs on Good Friday were plain, but they would have something written on them in pencil or pen. And then on Easter, the decorated eggs would come out. It isn't just the Slovaks and the Poles who decorated eggs. It was also the Pennsylvania Germans. And you can see this fancy decoration on them, but that would be all hand painted. And of course, who delivers the eggs? Who else but the German Easter Bunny? So there you go, more German traditions. They also had, would celebrate Christian celebrations like the Ascension and the Annunciation. Those are big days. And they had something called Heimat Fresht, which was Harvest Home. That was the big autumn celebration. Here you can see a church. That church is actually in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, full of produce from the harvest to celebrate the bounty. And that was a big celebration, but eventually it was eroded by another celebration, one that the Irish brought with them, and that was Halloween. And so they celebrated both. It was a time to dress up in costume. Speaking of dressing up in costume, this was something my dad imposed on me when I was a kid. Right before Christmas, he would start acting weird and chuckling and saying, "Oh, Belsnickel's coming. Belsnickel's coming." And Dad's drunk again. I don't know what he's talking about. Until I found out what Belsnickeling actually was. Belsnickel is one of those endless group of Santa's helpers. And he would come somewhere around St. Nicholas Day, between then and Christmas. And he would show up. He would be dressed in rags and fur. He would often be in blackface. He would usually be a neighbor, an older brother, an uncle, or someone like that. He would pound on the door. Sometimes he had an entourage of neighbors along with him. They would come in and sing. They would want someone to break out the booze. If you were high Germans, you had some alcohol around and some cookies, some sand tarts and things like that. And then Belsnickel would come in. And Belsnickel knew all the children by name. And he'd reach into his sack and throw on the floor some fruit, some nuts and things like that. And then out of his sack, he would pull a bundle of switches. And he'd say, "Oh, little Jimmy, I know you've been bad." And he would beat little Jimmy's behind with the switches and say, "You better be good for your mama and papa, or I will come back and beat you harder next year." Eventually, this became a celebration for everybody in the farm communities. They did this in Bedford County. They did this all over southern Pennsylvania and into Philadelphia. And that was to dress up. It was a form of mummery, to dress up and go from door to door, singing, demanding food and drink, and then go to the next farm, sing, and demand food and drink until everyone was pretty much plowed, except for the fields. And in the grand tradition of mummery, as you can see in this photo, it's a more recent photo, there was a bunch of role reversal. Yes, shocking. Pennsylvania farmers would dress up in drag, and Pennsylvania farm ladies would dress up as men or as monsters or some other thing, and they'd go around from door to door, and they just had a good time. Okay, so that was Belsnickeling. However, there's a little sub-note that you might enjoy. Belsnickeling got really out of hand because of the drinking, especially in more civilized places like Philadelphia, so that the city fathers banned it. There were too many reports of drunken people pounding on people's doors, throwing rocks through glass windows and things like that. So they announced that they were going to channel all this energy into something else. So they hired a guy, and I won't use the N-word, but it was actually in the Philadelphia newspaper, who was familiar with minstrel shows. But they used the N-word in this statement. He was going to organize a parade with people in costumes, so you could dress up, and would play minstrel music. Ever been to the Mummers Parade? That's the origin. It was to replace Belsnickeling. And then finally, of course, Christmas. And Christmas is really important. As you can see, they brought the idea of Christmas trees with them. Christmas trees were spread across Europe very, very early by a group of knights who traveled along through southern Europe to help the Spanish, the Habsburgs, drive the Muslims and the Jews, unfortunately, out of Spain, which is why they went north and ended up near the Netherlands. And so the Spanish said, well, we're this close to the Netherlands, we might as well just take them as our own anyway. That's why the Spanish occupied the Netherlands. This group of Teutonic Knights brought this idea of this tree at Christmas time throughout southern Europe. And that's where the Christmas tree idea originates from. Now, this center image here is called a putz. And this is a Moravian putz. So you see the Moravian star. That was one of their craft creations, a multi-pointed star. And they would make little houses out of cardboard and scraps of wood and things like that. And they were like a nativity scene. And the more elaborate your putz was, the more company you'd get, the more people would come and see you. And then finally, one of Martin Luther's ideas was the idea, he hated this idea of St. Nicholas, who was a Catholic saint, being a symbol of Christmas. So he wanted to replace him with an image of innocence and beauty, which he called the Christkinder, the Christ child. And you will see in Germany to this day parades, you see Krampus parades and things like that. Here comes St. Nicholas, but hand in hand with a beautiful child with a halo, it's the Christ child. But Christkinder and Kris Kringle are not too far apart. And one thing got kind of mutated into the other, and we're right back at Santa Claus once again. So, why am I telling you this? Well, I have German ancestry. So here we go. In 1611, in Saxony, a guy named Zachariah Koenig was born. His son was Andreas David Koenig. His son was Dietrich Philipp Koenig. Their son was Heinrich Koenig, who emigrated from the Palatine to Pennsylvania. Interestingly enough, I can't find any immigration records for him. He just showed up right around the Revolutionary War. And I'm wondering if either he was a POW, who was then released at the end of the war, or a deserter who said, yeah, I'm not going back there. So he Anglicanized his name to Henry King. Now, when he was buried, the Heinrich Koenig name was used by his children. So anyway, he worked as an innkeeper, and he had a son, Samuel, who lived in Paradise, Pennsylvania. And they had a son, David Alexander King, who kept a small hotel in a place called Railroad, Pennsylvania. And there's some family folklore I'll tell you about. He had three sons. One ran a carpet business in York. Railroad is just north of York. These were very respectable members of the York business community. His son, Walter, came to Williamsburg and married a woman named Cora Kreitzer. And one of their children, Harry King, was my grandfather, my mother's father. So that's where I came from. And there's Heinrich's tombstone. There is the Jackson House, which is the hotel and railroad that my great-great-grandfather ran, and it's still there. It's a bed and breakfast now called the Jackson House. And I talked about family legends. See that drum in the postcard? That drum belonged to a little drummer boy from the Civil War, and this was a family legend. And he was returning with his son. They had to stay overnight to make a rail connection. They stayed at the hotel. They couldn't pay, so the father traded his little boy's Civil War drum to my great-great-grandfather to pay for the business. And eventually the family donated it to the Pennsylvania Museum. Here's the truth. P.T. Barnum was famous for exploiting everything. And after the Civil War, if you were going to have a patriotic event, by golly, you had to have a little drummer boy. Now, realize that Ulysses S. Grant had banned drummer boys because he didn't want little children getting shot during battles in the Civil War. But Barnum didn't care about that. He found this little boy who wasn't even born during the Civil War, dressed him up, he could play a beat on the drum, and put him in his museum in New York. He was Master Ali Turner, the youngest drummer boy in world history. And so that was fine until that fad ended and Ali started growing up. So this was not a Civil War drum, nor a real drummer boy, but they did trade the painted drum from Barnum's museum, and it's still in the collection of the Pennsylvania archives, though they don't have it on display anymore, because obviously they figured out it was fake. Okay, so now we have this other bunch of people you've probably never heard of, the Imlers. So that goes back to 1580 with Peter Imler. The problem is during the 30 Years' War, they burned everything, including churches where all the church records were. So supposedly someone in this village, Schwabenroth, had a prodigious memory, and he wrote down all the people who ever lived in the village so they could recover the church records. This is where genealogy breaks down, folks. We're not sure his memory was that great, but we do have it back to Peter and his son Hans, and his son Hans Christoph, and then his son Wilhelm, and his son George Mark. Now you notice Wilhelm came to Philadelphia. Wilhelm got very ill on the voyage, and he literally died in isolation on the docks of Philadelphia. However, his son George Mark lived and became a farmer near York. He had a son, George Michael Imler, and several other children too. This is the sex part. They were very prolific breeders. They had very large families. George Michael fought in the Revolutionary War, along with several of his in-laws. And eventually he took his mother and his wife and his family and settled with the rest of the family in Bedford County, Pennsylvania. So that's why you have Imlers from Bedford County. So moving on, we have Jacob Imler, who was a son, and Daniel Imler, who was his son. And Daniel had two wives, Margaret Rebecca Reichard and Sarah Stambaugh, and their son was John Imler, and he had two wives. Mary Bowser had 4 children to him, and she died, and then Susan Klotz had 10 children. By the time I get through this Imler genealogy, I discovered I'm related to just about everybody in Bedford County with a German name. So his daughter, Hattie Imler, was born in 1886, married James Henry Allison, who was from Queen, Pennsylvania. And you can see the happy couple here in the upper right-hand corner. You can see who ran the household. Just look at those faces. He was actually a very talented musician. He was a terrible farmer, but he was a talented musician. But her dad was a ridge farmer who bred horses, and specifically trotters for people who had fancy carriages. So he was quite prosperous. He literally left an estate back then worth about $4,000, which back then was a heck of a lot of money. So her son was James H. Allison. He was a soldier in World War II. That was my dad. So we end up with me. And you can see that's my dad in the uniform there with his dad and his brother Clayton. Here's the George Imler Memorial. The Imler graveyard is on a farm, but no one has disturbed it. Some of the tombstones have been found and set up, but we don't know where George Michael is buried. So there is a marker on a farm down there close to where the Imler family cemetery was. So that brings us back to Doe, and that brings us to me, and that brings us to the end of our talk. So, thank you for coming, all you Pennsylvania Germans. I hope you realize that when you point at an Amish buggy and say, "Oh, the Pennsylvania Dutch," you don't know what you're talking about. we're all the Pennsylvania Dutch or Deutsch, and some of us just assimilated better than others. So thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it was rather long, but I hope you learned something. Thank you.
I don't know if there's any questions, but just to